hope you're all doing alright. We're 10 days into 2021 and it already feels like 2020, but we ordered it off Wish. And it's not quite what we wanted, but we can't be bothered to return it because there's all that postage. So we just stick with it. And hopefully it works in a way that we kind of want it to. So let's cheer ourselves up with a very gruesome horror story. Tonight's story is called The Coffin Makers by Raymond Williams, and I actually need my reading glasses on because the text is a little bit small. So be prepared for me to look like my granddad. The long white bony fingers of Samuel Peel placed the shiny brass screw carefully in the small hole. Holding the screw head with his left hand, he proceeded to twist it in place with his screwdriver, giving a sharp, wheezy grunt with each turn. He then stood back to survey his work. The large brass handle looked as straight as the others on the beautifully grained wood of the coffin. He entwined his skinny fingers around the gleaming brass handle and tried to shake it, but the handle was firmly held by the embedded screws. He gave a grunt of satisfaction. That had been the last of the handles. Now all that remained was the square brass plaque to go on the coffin lid, and he'd be finished for the day. He picked up the plaque from his workbench and studied the engraving. John William Edmonds, born 1786, died 1839. Each letter and figure was clear to read and perfectly formed. Yes, he thought to himself, I've made a good job of that. But it's a pity they didn't want more of it, like age 53 or Doctor of Medicine. Then he would have been paid a lot more for his job. His thoughts were interrupted by the clonk of a wooden mallet on a chisel handle. He looked round at his companion, working at a bench littered with wood scrapings. Thomas Carter was a giant of a man who looked more like a blacksmith than a carpenter. His large frame was bent over the coffin lid on his bench. His muscles in his thick arms rippled as he chiselled the last few pieces away. Thomas always turned out a first-class coffin, but this one was really the best he'd ever made. The reason why Thomas had excelled himself was that the coffin was for dear Dr. Edmonds. Dr. Edmonds, the man who'd nursed Thomas's sick mother for those last terrible 6 years of her life, when she'd wasted away slowly in front of their eyes. Dr. Edmonds, who had always taken so much care with the many injuries Thomas had sustained through a slipped chisel or an accidental hammer blow. Thomas had shown his gratitude and admiration for the doctor in the only way he could, by making a perfect coffin for him to lie in peace, until the day of judgment called him out of it to God's side. Samuel turned his attention back to the brass plaque and was in the process of screwing it down when the workshop door swung open to permit the entrance of Mr. Clive Thornwood, their employer. What, not ready yet? His thin, piercing voice shrilled through the room. The funeral's tomorrow, you know, not next month. He strutted around the workshop on his spidery legs, inspecting the workmanship with his black, beady eyes. Nice finish there, Thomas, he said, running an experienced finger along the coffin lid. Brass on yet, Samuel? He squawked. Handle's done, sir, and I'm on the plate now, he answered, returning to his task with the screwdriver. Good. Come on then, let's get the job finished. We're due over at the house in an hour's time. With that, he left as swiftly as he'd appeared, and soon the workmen could hear the clop of the horses' hooves outside as their employer got the cart ready. Later that evening, the three men trundled along the cobblestones with the bright coffin behind them on the car. At the doctor's house, they solemnly unloaded the box, and carefully manoeuvred it along the dark passageway into the candlelight of the front room. The widow, so they were informed by her sister, was too overcome to be present, but if they needed anything, she would be in the kitchen. When the door closed, they lowered the coffin lid onto 2 stools arranged in readiness. The body lay beneath a large white sheet, awaiting them. "Right, let's get on with it," said Thornwood, flicking the white sheet away. "I've got the head, you, Samuel, take the feet, Thomas the middle. Thomas, did you hear me? Take the middle." Thomas moved forward slowly, his face a picture of grief. His strong jaw quivered, while his large brown eyes brimmed with tears. The doctor was dressed in his best black suit, his golden watch and chain glinting across his waistcoat. In sharp contrast with the black cloth, his dry white skin seemed to shine in the candlelight. Carefully they eased him into the coffin, then straightened the creases of his clothes. "Right, screw the lid on, Samuel. I'm off to the 3 bells. Are you coming, Thomas?" But Thomas could not find his voice with which to answer. He merely shook his head, continued gazing at the kind, lined face he'd seen smiling and comforting so often, but was now so white and still. Suit yourself. What about you, Samuel?" "As soon as I've finished, sir, I'll be there." "Good, then I'll get you a jar of ale in readiness." He turned and was gone, leaving the 2 workmen alone with the coffin. But while Thomas was fondly gazing at the doctor's face, Samuel was busy taking stock of other things about the doctor. His sharp eyes had already spotted the watch and chain, and were now drinking in the rich greenness of the large stone decorating the doctor's thick gold ring on his left hand. If only Thomas had gone as well, the 2 precious articles would have been tucked away in his own pocket by now. "I'll finish off here, Thomas. You go now. I can see this is distressing you," he purred slyly. Thomas's voice still eluded him, so again he merely shook his head. Samuel cursed under his breath. He was not going to miss that beautiful ring or the gold watch. Still, if he couldn't get them now, he'd get them later. "Very well, I'll get on then," he said, turning his back on Thomas. Then, instead of getting the normal long screws from his pocket, he slipped his hand into another pocket and took out a few of his short, special ones. He slid the coffin lid over the corpse and proceeded to screw the shallow screws into the waiting holes. Then, with a satisfied look on his face, he left the house in the direction of the 3 bells. Although Samuel Peel wished for it every night, it was nearly 2 months after the doctor's funeral before the little village was blanketed by a thick fog. Around midnight, Samuel left his little cottage, his face well covered to keep the fog out, and his special short-handled spade clutched tightly beneath his long black coat. One had to be careful these days. There were often patrols around the graveyards, and Samuel had no intention of having his neck stretched at the end of a rope just yet. He fingered his way gingerly through the wet, smoke-filled streets, until at last his hands clasped the mossy walls of the graveyard. The fog was so thick he could see no more than 1 gravestone at a time. Eventually, he reached the stone he wanted. That of Dr. John William Edmonds. He took off his coat, folded it neatly at the side of his grave, took the candle from his pocket, lit it, and picked up his spade. He'd been digging up the yellow clay soil for quite some time when his spade jarred beneath his foot. He smiled to himself, wiped the globules of perspiration from his forehead with the back of his hand, and decided to have a short rest. He felt he'd done very well. He'd been forced to do most of the work by feel, as the swirling fog made his candle practically useless. Yet, he had reached the coffin in good time. It would be child's play now to wrench the coffin lid, thanks to his foresight of using the short screws. After quickly pocketing the watch and ring, he would clamber out of his slimy pit, shovel the clay back in, then off home to admire his spoils. He scraped the remaining patches of earth clear of the coffin lid, then wedged the blade of the spade into the dividing crack between coffin and lid. With a sharp heave and a twist that only came with years of practice, the lid crunched away from the base, with the screws rattling and rolling in all directions. He bent down and explored the steaming blackness with his hand. His searching fingertips settled on a patch of wet, slimy skin that felt like the face. His fingers crawled down along the hard row of waistcoat buttons, scattering tiny crawling things as they went. The cold metallic chain quickly arrested his hand, and in a second the watch and chain was resting in his own pocket. Now for the ring, he thought, and reached over to the side. His fingers reached the moist flesh of the dead man's hands, and in so doing knocked something wet and snail-like away. There was a soft plop as it hit the bottom of the coffin. Ah, this is it. His fingers closed around the cold ring and pulled, but it didn't move. He pressed around the doctor's fingers and realised they'd swollen. Cursing the dead man, he pulled the hand to him, gripped the back of the hand with his left and the ring finger with his right. Then, with a sharp tug, pushed the finger up and back towards the back of the hand. With a crisp crack, the finger bone snapped, and after a little while struggling and twisting, Samuel wrenched the finger away from the hand. The ring joined the watch in his pocket, while the finger was thrown back into the coffin. He straightened up, replaced the lid with his foot, then tossed the spade up out of the hole. He grasped the sides and began to claw his way up. The thick mud squelched through his fingers and seemed determined to prevent him getting a grip to get out. But finally, after a jump, he managed to cling his way up through the oozing slime. Then filled in the hole, collected his things, and melted away into the black swirling mist. A week after his nocturnal exploit, Samuel was laughing drunkenly at a coarse remark in the Three Bells. Really, he was celebrating the nice bit he'd made on a gold watch and chain he'd sold that day. He'd thought of selling the ring as well, but changed his mind. There was something about that ring. Anyway, he liked it. It did something for him. He'd kept it hidden at home with the watch until today. Then after selling the watch, he tried the ring on for effect. So well did it fit the bony finger that he was unable to get it off again. It's Providence, he told himself. The ring was meant for my finger. Fill her up, barman, he spluttered over the counter, banging the pewter tankard onto a stagnant pool of beer. He was leaning heavily against the strong wooden counter, twitching his eyebrows up and down at Sally, the waitress, when his foaming tankard was returned. He was just about to drink when he spotted Thomas coming into the tavern. "Hey, over here, Thomas, my lad. What are you drinking?" Thomas Carter steered his large frame through the tottering bodies to the counter. "Ale, thank you." His deep voice rumbled out the reply. Soon they were both drinking merrily, and even Thomas began laughing. During the evening, while Samuel's gaze was fixed upon the glistening brown curve of Sally's body as she bent down behind the counter, the happy smile on Thomas's face drained away. His eyelids stretched upwards, while his clear eyes riveted upon something that glinted with a green light on Samuel's hand. He knew that ring. He'd watched it often, while the hand wearing it had been tenderly bandaging him or holding a drink to his dying mother's lips. Then he looked from the ring to the man, and his eyes narrowed. His lips tightened, and Thomas swallowed back the anger and waited. At closing time, Samuel staggered from the tavern, arm in arm with the man twice his size. Samuel was laughing and singing, but his companion was silent. "Hold on, Thomas, you've missed the turn. You're as drunk as a judge," Samuel giggled, until he rocked at his companion. "No, this is the way." Thomas's voice was deep and controlled as he half carried his little companion along the tree-lined lane. No. Will you listen to me, you doubting Thomas?" Again he practically collapsed with mirth. But Thomas continued a little farther, until they came to the door of a long, low building. "You fool, Thomas. It's not time for work yet. This is..." But he stopped short when he saw the look on his companion's face. Then a huge fist flew at him, and before he could dodge it, he felt his face explode. His back thudded against the floor. A huge hand grasped his hair and winched him upwards, and before he could see through the bright lights in his eyes, he felt a cannonball pound into his stomach, and again he crashed into the dust. Something dragged his shoulder up, and he followed until a crashing blow sent his head jerking sideways, and mercifully the darkness engulfed his brain before he fell again. Emerging from the tunnel of blackness, Samuel Peel squinted at the strong light. He felt dizzy and sick, and his face was throbbing with a burning pain. He felt a sharp tug on his finger which made him wince. His eyes opened wider, and he saw Thomas trying to pull the glittering green ring from his finger. Samuel tried to tug his hand away, but failed to move it. His wrists felt as if they were paralysed. Then he saw that they were clamped in two vices on Thomas's workbench. What on earth was he doing here, kneeling on the floor with his hands clamped rigid? Had Thomas gone mad? Why on earth was he tugging at the ring? Thomas had taken a fancy to it. That was it. He wanted the ring. But Thomas had no right to it. It was his ring, and he was going to keep it. "It won't come off, Thomas," he slurred through bleeding lips. "Anyway, it's mine. Leave it alone. Do you hear? It's my ring." Thomas hissed breath out through his hairy, wide nostrils and let go of the ring. "I want to go home, Thomas. Take me home," Samuel pleaded pitifully. Thomas made no reply. He merely picked up his wooden mallet and selected one of the sharp chisels from the rack. Samuel gasped in disbelief as he saw the sharp edge of the chisel being placed above the finger bearing the ring. Then the black shadow of the hammer lifting. Then the pain shot through his arm and seared his brain. Red tears of blood were squirting out from the stump onto the workbench. The pain brought tears to his eyes, a thumping to his ears, and a screech to his throat. Thomas, meanwhile, removed the ring from the severed finger, wiped it clean of blood, and put it away in his pocket. "Thomas! Thomas!" The screams were desperate and echoed round the workshop. But Thomas seemed quite unperturbed, and was again taking up his tools. Another precise thunk with the hammer, and another digit flew across the bench, leaving a red trail behind it. The hammer rose and fell again and again and again, until Samuel, unable to bear the increasing pain, fainted. When he came slowly to, there was no light to hurt his eyes this time. Instead, he was being deafened by the clatter of thunder above him. It sounded like earth spitting against wood. There it was again. Where was he? He started to grope with his hands, then winced with pain as the raw stumps of his fingers banged against something hard. Hell, it was stuffy in here, he thought. Where am I? The steady pounding of the earth was beginning to get fainter now, but the familiar smell of freshly dug earth seemed stronger. The next instant, he was sure his heart stopped pumping as the horrible truth surged in on his brain. He was being buried. Thomas had gone completely mad. He was burying him alive. He beat his aching hands around him to make sure. They moved as far as the confined space of the coffin would allow. His heart was pumping madly now. He could hear the thumping echoing through the narrow box. He thrashed at the coffin lid with his useless stumps, but it was no good. He could do nothing. He couldn't hear the earth being shoveled anymore now. All he could hear was the rhythmic thump of his heart and gasping of his breathing. The air was getting hot and stale. The pounding and gasping got stronger and stronger. His wild twisting and turning got him more and more tangled until he could no longer move. He opened his mouth wide to scream to protect his ears from the monotonous thumping. But all that happened was that the little stump quivered and a pathetic gurgling noise emerged. Surely Thomas could have been satisfied with all his fingers. He could, at least, have left him his tongue to die with. That escalated quick, didn't it? It really jumped up a notch. Stay safe. I'm thinking about everybody I know that's struggling at the minute, whatever you're struggling with. So just take care, guys. There's not much more I can say. Just take care.